Guam, September 1945. The war is over, but for the women behind the barbed wire, it doesn't feel like peace. It feels like judgment waiting to begin. Rain pounds the tin roofs of the American internment camp, turning the ground into rivers of red mud. The air smells of rust, salt, and fear. Asami Shimizu presses her hands to the fence, watching through the mist. On the other side, the unthinkable is happening. The American guards have opened the gates, and the Japanese prisoners, the same soldiers who once swore to die before surrender, are walking out. Not to be executed, not to be shamed, but to work freely beside the men who defeated them, and to walk freely wherever trust could reach. No rifles raised, no shouting, only the clatter of tools and the low murmur of rain. For Asami, it's a sight more terrifying than any battlefield. Mercy from the enemy, because in that single moment, she realizes everything she was taught about honor, about America, about war, might have been a lie. By the end of August 1945, Japan's empire existed only on paper. The emperor's voice, thin, trembling, and broadcast across a ruined nation, had ordered his people to lay down their arms. For millions of soldiers and civilians scattered across the Pacific, surrender was not just unthinkable, it was unspeakable. To be captured was to vanish from honor itself. Guam, once a battlefield soaked in fire and blood, became one of the first laboratories of peace. After the island's liberation in 1944, American forces had transformed its coastlines into bases and its inland valleys into makeshift holding centers. By September 1945, those centers swelled with more than 50,000 Japanese, a mixture of soldiers, nurses, and clerical women gathered from Saipan, Tinian, and the northern islands. They arrived in silence, gaunt, exhausted, some still carrying field manuals or photographs of families they might never see again. Many expected imprisonment under guard towers and bayonets. Instead, they found something else entirely. A strange order wrapped in mercy. American policy had shifted in the war's final weeks. General Douglas MacArthur, preparing to occupy Japan itself, instructed all Pacific commands to treat surrendering personnel according to the Geneva Convention. "The war is over," one directive read. "Our mission now is civilization." It was a phrase the Japanese could barely translate. Inside Camp Tian, discipline ruled, but cruelty did not. Prisoners were deloused, fed rice and tinned meat, and assigned work details to rebuild the very airfields once bombed by their own side. Women like Asami were separated into auxiliary enclosures, rows of canvas tents built on elevated planks to keep out the monsoon water. Medical officers checked them daily. American nurses distributed quinine and soap. To the captives, it felt like a trick. For Asami, the confusion deepened each dawn. She woke to the sound of American reveille, to engines starting, to laughter echoing through rain. Through the fence, she could see Japanese men, former corporals and engineers, marching out with shovels and paint buckets, not rifles. They returned at dusk without escorts, heads unbowed. None had fled. None were punished. The American guards carried their rifles casually, slung over one shoulder. Some smoked with the prisoners during breaks. They shared water from the same barrels. There was no vengeance here, no retribution. Only work, discipline, and an uneasy peace. It was not kindness that shocked the Japanese most. It was freedom. They had expected pain. Instead, they were handed choices. When to rest, when to eat, when to speak. Such liberties were unfamiliar, even in their own army. The island itself seemed complicit in the transformation. Where bunkers once smoldered, gardens began to rise. Coconut palms framed the new American headquarters. The same runways that had launched bombers toward Tokyo now launched transport planes filled with medicine and letters of home. From her corner of the women's compound, Asami wrote small notes in a hidden notebook. Observations, questions, fragments of disbelief. "They treat us like humans," one line read, written in trembling brushstrokes. "Is this mercy or victory?" Every day, the fences rusted a little more under the salt rain. Every day, the distance between enemy and ally seemed to shrink. Yet for the women watching from behind the wire, understanding that change would take longer than survival itself, because to accept mercy, they first had to believe they deserved it. In the months that followed Japan's surrender, the United States faced a question no army had ever faced on such a scale. How do you manage an enemy that has surrendered completely? Across the Pacific, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians were still scattered through island jungles, caves, and bombed-out garrisons. Most had been told that Americans tortured prisoners, that capture meant humiliation, worse than death. Yet the truth, when it arrived, looked nothing like the stories they had been fed. On Guam, that truth began quietly. The U.S. Navy and the Army's civil affairs units reorganized the island's old airfield zones into temporary repatriation camps. The goal was not punishment but control. And beyond control, rehabilitation. Prisoners were registered, photographed, and then given work assignments that matched their wartime skills. Engineers mended roads. Medics treated the sick. Farmers replanted sugarcane. The surprise was not the labor itself. It was the freedom within it. By October 1945, selected groups of Japanese POWs were allowed to leave the fences entirely under minimal supervision. They cleared debris along the Tumen Bay coast and built wooden huts for displaced Chamorro civilians. The Americans called it trust labor. The Japanese called it impossible. In Japanese military tradition, a prisoner was a ghost, a man who had already forfeited honor. To see those ghosts walking unguarded through a former battlefield, tools in hand, laughing with Americans, felt like watching the laws of war dissolve. Each evening, the same men returned to camp on their own. U.S. reports later noted that out of thousands who worked outside the wire, almost none attempted escape. The reason was simple. They had nowhere to go, and no wish to dishonor the strange peace they had been given. For the Americans, this leniency was deliberate. General MacArthur's staff understood that the coming occupation of Japan would depend not only on military power, but on moral authority. "Show them civilization," one memo read, "and they will rebuild their own." The experiment began here, on the Pacific's edge. Instead of barbed wire brutality, Guam's camps became a demonstration of American discipline tempered by mercy, a message broadcast far beyond the island. Inside the women's compound, that message echoed slowly. Asami Shimizu and the other nurses were allowed to tend small vegetable plots, mend uniforms, and teach basic English to fellow detainees. American medics invited them to assist in the field clinic, a gesture unthinkable months earlier. Each day, Asami watched groups of men pass beyond the fence line and vanish into the green hills. The guards barely glanced up. When evening came and the same men returned, unchained and smiling, something inside her shifted. In the quiet after lights out, she tried to understand it. The Americans were not weak. They had destroyed the empire, yet they ruled without cruelty. Their strength lay not in the weapons that had ended the war, but in the restraint that followed it. It was a kind of victory she had never been taught to imagine. From the officers' quarters came rumors of shock and resentment. Some senior Japanese captives refused to step outside the wire at all, claiming that to walk freely under the enemy's permission was the deepest shame. Others, younger men, followed the Americans willingly, driven by curiosity or simple exhaustion. Between those two generations stretched the moral fracture of a defeated nation. Beyond Guam, similar programs began on Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa. Everywhere the pattern repeated. Controlled trust, humane conditions, and a dawning realization among the Japanese that the war's true lesson was not about conquest, but character. On Guam, the rains gradually eased. The fences rusted under the salt air, and every day, from her corner of the women's camp, Asami watched the gates open wider. The enemy was teaching her people something their own empire never had: how to be free without victory. For Asami Shimizu, the days inside Camp Tian no longer followed the rhythm of war. They followed the rain. It came in bursts, pounding the tin roofs, then vanishing into silence that felt almost sacred. In those pauses she listened. The creak of boots on wet planks, the clang of metal buckets, the distant laughter of men working beyond the fence. At first, she refused to watch them. Pride was easier than curiosity, yet each afternoon her eyes drifted toward the gate. There was something hypnotic in its routine. The moment it opened, the men stepping out, the guards turning away as if the enemy no longer existed. They walked freely, their silhouettes dissolving into the misted hills. When they returned at dusk, the light caught their faces, tanned, calm, strangely at peace. She had known hunger, air raids, and the smell of death in field hospitals. She had memorized the rules of obedience. But this quiet decency from an enemy, felt unbearable. It wasn't kindness she feared. It was what kindness revealed, that everything she'd been told about the world might have been wrong. One afternoon, while assisting in the medical tent, an American sergeant dropped a pack of gauze beside her table. "You worked hospitals?" he asked in slow English. Asami nodded, unsure whether to bow. The man smiled, awkward but genuine, then pointed to a wounded Japanese laborer outside. "You help," he said. She did. Her hands, which had once bandaged soldiers under fire, now tied dressings with the same precision. But for an army she had been taught to hate. When the task ended, the sergeant offered her half a biscuit. She hesitated, then took it. The taste, sweet, ordinary, felt almost dangerous. That night, Asami wrote in her notebook again, "They trust us. They feed us. They let us walk. Perhaps mercy is another kind of weapon." Among the women, silence grew heavier. Some refused the Americans' gestures. Others accepted them in secret. But all of them watched the same thing. Their own soldiers walking beyond the wire each morning, not as prisoners, but as men allowed to rebuild what they had destroyed. To Asami, that sight was more powerful than any victory parade, because every step those men took in freedom chipped away at the empire that had once ruled her heart. The decision to let Japanese prisoners walk freely across Guam wasn't naive compassion. It was deliberate strategy. Behind every open gate stood a doctrine born from the American belief that victory meant more than ending a war. It meant defining what peace should look like. General Douglas. MacArthur's headquarters in Manila had issued the order in early September 1945. Demonstrate the principles of civilization. Punishment is not reconstruction. The directive filtered down through Navy and Army channels to the islands still bristling with resentment and ruin. Commanders were told to replace domination with discipline, to teach trust where fear had ruled. In Washington, policymakers saw mercy as the strongest propaganda. A photograph of unguarded Japanese laborers could travel farther and cut deeper than any speech. It proved that America's strength came not only from its weapons, but from its restraint. To Japanese officers, this was psychological warfare of a kind they could not decipher. Their empire had equated control with obedience. Here the Americans controlled through freedom. Every shovel lifted by a prisoner outside the fence, every meal shared without chains, undermined years of imperial conditioning. Yet the policy carried practical genius. Guarding thousands of captives across the Pacific consumed men and supplies the United States no longer wished to spend. Trust, if it worked, was cheaper than barbed wire. And it did work. By December, reports from Guam, Saipan, and Okinawa confirmed almost total compliance. A U.S. field commander wrote, "They do not flee because we have made them part of rebuilding what they destroyed." For the Americans, this experiment became a quiet rehearsal for the occupation of Japan itself. The aim was not to erase the Japanese spirit, but to redirect it, to replace devotion to the emperor with respect for order, to make cooperation a new form of duty. For Asami Shimizu and others watching from the women's camp, this strategy was invisible yet deeply felt. The gates opened each morning not out of forgiveness, but calculation. Yet what the Americans calculated, they also believed. They were building a moral monument in the ruins of an empire, proof that mercy could conquer where armies could not. And as word of these policies spread across the Pacific, the stage was set for the most startling transformation of all. The moment when obedience born of fear would turn into trust, born of choice. It happened without announcement. No bugle, no orders, no ceremony, just the morning sun cutting through a sky washed clean by rain. The women woke to the sound of trucks idling, to the smell of coffee drifting from the American mess hall, and to the faint metallic clang of the gate being unlatched. At first, Asami thought it was another work detail. The guards always led the men out at dawn, tools in hand, shoulders stiff with uncertainty. But this morning was different. The guards didn't line up with rifles. They simply stood aside. One of them, a young corporal from Kansas, gave a small wave toward the open road and said quietly, "You know the way," and the men walked, not marched, walked. No one shouted. No one counted them. They passed through the gate in twos and threes, their shadows long on the red earth. Beyond the fence lay the fields they had been clearing for weeks. But today, there were no boundaries. The gate remained wide open. Asami felt her heart quicken. The other women crowded near the wire, whispering in disbelief. Some thought it was a test, a cruel trick meant to expose disobedience. Others prayed aloud. But as the hours passed, the impossible continued. Prisoners came and went freely, speaking with the Americans, collecting supplies, even helping Chamorro villagers repair huts destroyed during the battle. By noon, the camp felt unrecognizable. A group of American engineers invited several Japanese mechanics to help service a jeep. The men laughed when one of them accidentally splashed oil on his sleeve. A sergeant handed over a rag instead of punishment. Freedom, Asami realized, had not been granted all at once. It had crept in quietly, like the morning light, standing by the fence. She pressed her palm against the rusted wire. Beyond it, the once feared enemy shared cigarettes, jokes, and silence. The world she had known, the world where the strong ruled through fear, was dissolving before her eyes. Late that afternoon, when the first group of laborers returned, there was no head count. No orders barked. The guards nodded, and the men simply walked back inside as though coming home. Not one had fled. For the first time since her capture, Asami felt something shift deep inside. A fragile, dangerous thing she hadn't felt since childhood. Hope that evening. As the sun began to sink beyond the palms, the impossible became undeniable. The gate, that iron symbol of captivity, remained open. American guards leaned against sandbags, smoking lazily, watching the horizon with no concern. Beyond the wire, a handful of Japanese prisoners still worked in the fading light, finishing a drainage ditch that snaked toward the main road. Among them was an older lieutenant, his uniform clean but threadbare, his back straight in the old imperial posture. Asami recognized him. His name was Lieutenant Arata, once a medical officer from Saipan. He had never spoken much, and he carried himself with the stiff dignity of a man born to follow rules. When the workday ended, the Americans called out, a friendly wave, a gesture toward the camp. But Arata didn't move immediately. He stood still in the red light, eyes fixed on the open gate. For a moment, Asami thought he might walk away. Into the jungle, into exile, into whatever pride still survived inside him. Then, slowly he bent down, wiped his hands on his trousers, and began to walk back toward the camp. No one ordered him. No one escorted him. The Americans didn't even look up. He crossed the open ground and stepped through the gate as the sun fell behind the ridge. The fence glowed gold in the dying light. For Asami, the sight was unbearable and beautiful. She felt tears rising, though she didn't understand why. Perhaps it was the quiet, the lack of struggle. Perhaps it was the way Lieutenant Arata carried himself, not as a defeated man, but as a human being reclaiming his own choice. That night, she wrote again in her small notebook, "They opened the gates, and no one ran." I think that is what victory means. When darkness settled, the guards didn't lock the gate. The rain began again, soft and steady, tapping against the tin roofs like a heartbeat. Somewhere outside, a harmonica played an American tune. Slow, mournful, but strangely gentle, Asami lay awake, eyes open to the dark, realizing that the world had changed quietly, not with bombs or speeches, but with the sound of footsteps returning freely. By the end of 1945, word of Guam's open gate camp had reached Manila and Washington. The reports sounded almost unreal. Zero escapes, no uprisings, complete discipline. Where other armies might have tightened their grip, the Americans loosened theirs, and order held. The experiment began spreading quietly. On Saipan, Okinawa, and even in parts of the Philippines, officers tested the same policy. Work details without chains, free movement inside villages, shared meals with locals. Everywhere the results were the same. Prisoners worked harder, morale rose, and violence disappeared. At Camp Tian, the women's compound also changed. The fences still stood, but they no longer divided enemies, only routines. American nurses began visiting regularly, trading supplies for Japanese sewing and medical help. The Americans called it rehabilitation. The women called it shame turned to purpose. For Asami Shimizu, every day felt like a lesson in contradiction. She still wore the insignia patch from her old uniform, though its colors had faded to gray. Each morning she watched the men leave for work, some pushing carts, others driving trucks, and each evening she saw them return through the still open gate, tired but laughing. The Americans kept careful notes. Lieutenant Colonel John B. Howard, commander of the Guam Detention Service, wrote in his logbook, "These prisoners behave not because we compel them, but because we have allowed them to remember they are men." Numbers backed him up. By early 1946, the average escape rate among Japanese POWs across U.S. Pacific camps had fallen below 0.1%, the lowest in recorded military history. In contrast, Soviet and Chinese camps reported chaos and rebellion. To the U.S. command, the difference was proof of principle. Mercy worked. But for the Japanese captives themselves, mercy was harder to accept than punishment. Some older officers, unable to bear the quiet dignity of defeat, asked to be reassigned to stricter compounds. Others began to soften. One sergeant gave his American guard a handmade belt woven from palm fiber. Another, a former mechanic, volunteered to repair the camp's generators. Asami noticed it most in their eyes. The emptiness she'd seen in August, that hollow stare of surrender, began to fade. These men no longer looked conquered. They looked human again. In January 1946, American photographers arrived to document the program. The images, Japanese POWs smiling beside U.S. soldiers, appeared in military bulletins and Red Cross reports across the Pacific. One caption read, "Freedom through trust." When Asami saw the photograph, she understood something the camera could not capture. The cost of that trust was pride, and the reward was peace. When the repatriation orders finally came, Camp Tian began to dissolve like a memory. The men packed their few belongings, notebooks, letters, handmade trinkets, and lined up for the ships that would take them home to a country they no longer recognized. The Americans saluted them as they boarded. No jeers, no triumph, just quiet respect. For many Japanese prisoners, that farewell was harder than captivity itself. In a world where they had expected humiliation, they had found something deeper, forgiveness wrapped in discipline. They left Guam not as prisoners, but as witnesses to a new idea. That mercy could rebuild what pride had destroyed. Asami Shimizu watched them go from the edge of the women's compound. The fences stood open now, swaying in the island wind. She clutched the fountain pen her father had given her before she joined the army, the one she'd kept hidden through every inspection. For the first time, she used it without fear. On a scrap of paper torn from a medical form, she began to write a letter. It was addressed not to her family, but to an American nurse named Margaret, the woman who had once shared medicine and biscuits under the tent roof. "I used to think mercy was weakness," Asami wrote in careful strokes. "Now I think it is the only kind of strength that lasts." When she finished, she folded the letter neatly and placed it inside a Red Cross envelope. It would travel across the ocean, one message among millions. But for her, it was the true end of the war. Months later, back in Yokohama, Asami walked through streets still scarred by firebombs. Yet she saw something new in the ruins. Small shops reopening, children laughing, American trucks delivering food instead of death. The same flag that once flew above her camp now flew above the ships bringing aid. Historians would later write that America's post-war success in Japan began not in Tokyo, but in places like Guam, in the quiet moments when enemies discovered they no longer needed to fear each other. For Asami, the memory of that day, the gate standing open, the sound of boots splashing through mud, the laughter that replaced orders, never faded. Whenever she heard rain strike a tin roof, she was back there again, watching her world end and begin in the same breath. Years later, when the world had rebuilt itself into something quieter, Asami Shimizu would sometimes wake to the sound of rain against the roof and pause, listening. To anyone else it was only weather. To her it was memory. In that sound lived the rhythm of Guam, the tin roofs, the red clay, the voices of men once called enemies walking freely through the storm. She could still see the open gate, the mud clinging to their boots, the faint smile on the face of the American guard who never lifted his rifle again. History would measure that period by treaties and policies, by statistics and strategies. But for those who had lived it, the truest victory could not be counted in numbers. It lived in gestures, in the sharing of a cigarette, a bandage, a meal, a smile across a fence no longer needed. The Americans had won the war with fire and steel, but they had ended it with mercy, and that mercy did what no army ever could. It rebuilt the defeated without breaking their spirit. In Japan, children grew up learning English words instead of battle songs. Nurses rebuilt hospitals. Farmers replanted fields. The same hands that once carried rifles now carried tools. The nation that had known only obedience began to understand freedom. Asami never spoke publicly of her captivity, but in her later years, as a teacher in Hiroshima, she kept one photograph on her desk, not of soldiers, but of a gate standing open under the rain. When asked what it meant, she would smile faintly and say, "It means that even behind barbed wire, humanity can still find its way out." The rain would fall, the world would move on, and peace, fragile, imperfect, miraculous, would continue to hold. Because in 1945, on a small island in the Pacific, the victors had chosen mercy over vengeance, and in doing so, they had taught even the defeated how to walk freely again.